The cable tightened around the bumper of the old pickup truck, with a sound that carried farther than it should have in the quiet morning air. Diana Mercer stood on the granite steps of the glass tower, her coat still buttoned from the cold, her voice the kind of level that doesn't need volume to be absolute. "Get it out of my sight." The man from the towing company did not look at her twice. He did the job he was called to do. And the man standing beside the truck, the one who had driven it there, the one who watched it being lifted by the front axle, without saying a single word. He simply picked up the case he was carrying and walked 2 blocks east and disappeared. Nobody on those steps watched him go. Nobody thought to. But here is what none of them could have known at that moment. Inside that same glass tower, on the 29th floor, there was a contract sitting in a leather binder. A contract worth $1.8 billion. And the only person alive who could see exactly what was wrong with it was the man they had just towed away. To understand how that morning broke the way it did, you need to go back. Not years, just weeks. And you need to start not in the glass tower, but in a narrow workshop on the east side of the Allegheny River in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where a man named Nathan Collier had been quietly doing contract work for smaller firms since leaving an industry that had used him up and spat him out without ceremony. Nathan was 41 years old. He kept a tidy workshop on Hartwell Street, just east of the 31st Street Bridge, in one of those blocks where the buildings were old enough to have been something else before they were what they were now. The sign above the roll-up door said only his last name. No logo, no tagline. Just Collier, in unpainted letters on a piece of Douglas fir he had cut himself. The workshop smelled of machine oil and cold concrete, and, on mornings when he arrived early enough, the faint trace of river water carried in on the air. He had 2 clients that week. A medical equipment firm in Shadyside that needed a calibration unit serviced, and a private office building in the downtown core that needed a secondary power relay inspected before their annual compliance review. He kept a paper schedule because he had no interest in syncing calendars with anyone. He wrote the addresses by hand, the way his father had taught him to write anything worth remembering. The life he had now was smaller than the one he had left. That was deliberate. Nathan Collier had once sat in rooms very much like the ones inside the glass tower on Fifth Avenue, where Diana Mercer ran her firm. He had once written memos that nobody read, raised concerns that nobody wanted to hear, and watched deals close that should have been stopped at the door. He had left that world cleanly and without announcing it to anyone, and in the 4 years since, he had not once looked back with regret. There were mornings, very early, when he would stand at the workbench with a cup of coffee and think about a particular Tuesday in Charlotte, North Carolina, when he had spent 12 hours writing a 30-page analysis of a contract structure that 3 senior partners had then rejected because it slowed the deal down. He still remembered the exact feeling of sliding that document into a recycling bin in the hallway outside Conference Room B. It was a very specific feeling, the kind that a person does not forget no matter how many years pass over it. He put the mug in the sink and loaded his equipment case into the bed of the truck and drove toward the downtown core. Diana Mercer's day had started at 5:40 in the morning. It always did. She read the overnight briefings, before the city was awake enough to interrupt her, approved the wire transfers her operations team had flagged, and drank 1 cup of black coffee, standing at the window of her apartment on the 22nd floor of a building on Stanwix Street. From there she could see the dark outline of the rivers, the bridges, the office towers just beginning to catch the first light. She had built Mercer Capital over 16 years. She had done it through a combination of intelligence, precision, and a particular quality that people in her industry described as decisiveness, and that people who had been on the wrong end of it sometimes described as something else. Mercer Capital was 2 days away from closing the largest deal in its history, a joint venture with a Dallas-based firm called Vantage Ridge Partners. $1.8 billion, structured as a blended equity and governance partnership. Every analyst on her floor had spent the past month in rooms that smelled of cold pizza and highlighter ink. The signing was set for 11 in the morning. Diana wanted the building clean, the lobby uncluttered, and nothing. Not a stray catering cart, not an unfamiliar vehicle, not a single thing out of register, visible when the Vantage Ridge delegation arrived. She saw the truck at 7:43. It was parked in the executive bay in front of the tower's main entrance, a bay marked with brushed metal signage that specified authorized vehicles only. The truck was old. It had a ladder rack across the bed and a dent along the rear quarter panel and tires that had done real work. The man beside it was holding a gray equipment case in one hand and scanning the building service entrance the way someone scans for a door they were told would be unlocked. He wore a canvas work jacket and jeans that were clean but faded. His boots were the kind that kept their shape through use rather than care. He was not looking at her. He was not looking at anything except the service entrance 60 feet to the left. She did not break stride. She pulled her phone from her coat pocket before she reached the revolving door and called building security in a voice that did not require emphasis to communicate finality. "There's a vehicle in the executive bay. A pickup truck. Have it towed immediately." She was already inside before the call ended. She did not look back. Nathan heard the tow truck pull up. He heard the hook engage the front axle. He turned, not quickly, the way a person turns when they already know what they're going to see. He watched the front end of the pickup rise off the pavement. He did not argue. He did not raise his hand to stop it. He looked up once at the name on the tower, Mercer Capital, in steel letters across the glass facade, and he read it the way a person reads something they intend to file somewhere they can find it later. Then he set the equipment case on the sidewalk and took a breath that he did not share with anyone around him. He called his client on the 14th floor, explained that the delivery would need to be rescheduled, said it without edge, apologized without self-pity, and hung up. He picked up the case and walked east. At 10 in the morning, the 29th floor of the Mercer Capital Tower looked the way it always looked before a large signing. Controlled, precise, and coiled. The conference table was walnut, the water glasses were arranged at equal intervals, and the binders on the secondary table had been organized by Margaret Holt, head of legal, who had spent 6 weeks reading the Vantage Ridge contract and had not fully slept in 3 of them. Margaret was the kind of attorney who read contracts the way surgeons read imaging results. Slowly, twice, with the particular attention of someone who understands that what isn't there is often more important than what is. She had flagged 11 items in the preliminary draft and had them all resolved. She had one remaining concern, a small one she had been circling for 2 days without being able to articulate it precisely enough to raise it formally. She had told herself it was probably nothing. She told herself again as she opened the final binder. Philip Crane, the chairman, sat at the far end of the table, reading a summary document through a pair of reading glasses he kept in his breast pocket. Philip had been at Mercer Capital since the beginning. He had signed off on the Vantage Ridge structure 4 weeks ago and had trusted Margaret's review completely, as he always did. Diana took her seat at the head of the table. "Walk me through the final structure," she said. Margaret began. The capital contribution timeline, the governance schedule, the exit provisions, the revenue-sharing mechanism. Everything moved cleanly until she reached page 117. She stopped there. She read the page again, then she turned back to page 74, then forward to page 91. She set her pen down on the table in a way that was not quite deliberate, not quite unconscious. "I need a moment on page 117, she said. Diana looked up. Philip lowered his glasses. Margaret explained, carefully and without drama, that there was an interlocking provision she could not fully map, a capital ratio trigger clause that connected to 2 other clauses in a way that produced a structural outcome she could not account for. She had read it 3 times. She was not willing to recommend execution without understanding it. The room did not change visibly, but something in it tightened, the way a wire tightens when additional load is placed on it. Slowly, without sound, until it is very close to its limit. Diana asked Margaret to be specific. Margaret said that was the problem. The clause was too well constructed for her to find the flaw through normal analysis. Whoever had written it knew exactly how to write it, so that the flaw was not visible from inside the language. It had to be approached from outside, from someone who had seen the pattern before. At the back of the table, along the wall, a junior analyst named Scott Beal cleared his throat. He was 29 years old and had been at Mercer Capital for 14 months and had never spoken in a senior meeting. He had been brought into this room because his supervisor was out sick and someone needed to operate the presentation display. He raised his hand halfway, then lowered it, then spoke anyway. "I've seen something like this structure once before," he said. Every person at the table looked at him. He did not enjoy the attention. He spoke to the middle distance. 3.5 years ago, a firm in Charlotte, North Carolina, almost signed something with a nearly identical trigger mechanism. A pension fund. A two-party joint venture with an embedded governance handoff clause. Philip leaned forward, and there was an analyst who caught it. He wrote a 30-page analysis. The firm rejected it. He left the industry several months later. Diana's voice did not change pitch. "Do you know his name?" Scott already knew why she was asking, and what it meant that she was asking it. That knowledge sat somewhere between his chest and his throat. "Nathan Collier," he said. The room was quiet in the particular way that rooms get quiet when everyone in them is simultaneously reaching the same conclusion from different directions. Margaret Holt put her hand flat on top of the contract binder. Philip Crane took his reading glasses off and set them on the table. Diana sat back in her chair and did not move for several seconds. She was not thinking about the contract. She was thinking about 7:43 in the morning, and a pickup truck in the executive bay, and a man in a canvas work jacket, holding an equipment case and scanning for a service entrance. She was thinking about the order she had given before she even reached the revolving door. She could not remember his face because she had not looked at it. She had looked past him the way a person looks past furniture. She had towed away the only person in Pittsburgh who might be able to tell her what was buried in page 117. The Vantage Ridge delegation was 53 minutes away. Diana rose from her seat and walked to the window at the far end of the room. She stood with her back to the table and looked at the city below, which looked exactly as it had always looked, and gave her nothing in return. "Postpone the signing by 4 hours," she said. Philip began to speak. She did not turn around. "Tell Vantage Ridge that legal has surfaced a final compliance item. Be cordial. Be brief. Buy me 4 hours." Margaret was already on her phone. Scott Beale sat very still, aware that he had done something he could not undo, and not yet certain whether it had been the right thing. Diana turned from the window and asked Scott one question. "Where is Nathan Collier now?" Scott shook his head. "I don't know. He left the industry completely. I tried to find him once when I was researching the Charlotte case for a paper I was writing. There was no professional profile anywhere. I heard he does contract maintenance work somewhere in Pittsburgh. That's all I found." Diana put on her coat and walked out of the room. In her office, she stood behind her desk with both palms flat on the surface. Her assistant was already running archived records from the Charlotte firm. She made 2 calls from a number they had pulled from an old industry directory. Neither call was answered. A third call, to a commercial licensing database, gave her a registered business address on Hartwell Street on the east side of the river. She took it down on a notepad in her own handwriting. Then she picked up her bag and took the elevator to the lobby. The impound lot was on the south side of the Crosstown Boulevard, behind a chain-link fence with a hand-painted address marker. She had her driver stop there first. The clerk behind the scratched plastic partition pulled up the record on a monitor that was at least a decade old. The truck had been released at 9:47 that morning. The owner had come in person, paid the fee in cash, $280, and driven it out without a word. The clerk slid the carbon release form across the counter. The name at the top was Nathan Collier. The address matched the one she had written on the notepad. She folded the paper once and placed it in her coat pocket and got back in the car. Hartwell Street looked like a street that had made a quiet peace with being overlooked. Low brick buildings, roll-up doors. A few trucks parked at odd angles. The workshop with Collier on the sign had its door half raised and the truck was parked just inside. She told her driver to wait at the corner and walked to the entrance alone. The inside was more orderly than she expected. Metal shelving along the left wall, labeled by category, arranged by size. A workbench under a hanging lamp at the center. A second smaller bench along the back wall with hand tools aligned in a row. Nathan Collier was standing at the main bench with his sleeves rolled and a wrench in his hand, tightening a fitting on a piece of equipment she couldn't identify. He looked up when her shadow crossed the floor. His expression did not shift. He set the wrench down, picked up a rag, wiped his hands, and waited. He did not ask her what she wanted. He did not greet her. He simply waited with the unhurried patience of a man who had already spent his day being surprised by other people's choices and had decided not to be surprised again. Diana stepped inside. The space smelled of oil and cold metal. She had been in thousands of rooms in her career, and she had almost always known how to begin. She stood in Nathan Collier's workshop, and she did not know how to begin. So she did the one thing she could. She said his name. Mr. Collier. He nodded once. I know who you are, he said. His voice was even. Not warm, not hostile, even the way a measurement is even. I read the name on your building this morning. She held his gaze. It took an effort she did not show. I came to ask for your help. Nathan folded the rag in thirds and set it on the bench. He looked at her for a moment before he spoke. That's a fair distance from where we started. Yes, she said. It is. She reached into her bag and placed a bound copy of the contract on the corner of the workbench. There's a clause on page 117 that our legal team cannot fully map. It's linked to provisions on pages 74 and 91. I was told you recognized a nearly identical structure once before, in Charlotte. Nathan looked at the binder. He did not pick it up. Charlotte, he said. That's right. That was 4 years ago. I wrote a 30-page analysis. His eyes moved to her. Nobody in that building wanted to read it. I know, she said. There was a pause. I'm not asking you to come back to this industry, Diana said. I'm asking you to look at one document for 1 hour. He walked to the other side of the bench. He picked up the wrench again, not to use it, just something to hold. He stood with it in his hand. Ms. Mercer, I was at your building this morning to deliver a calibration unit to the 14th floor. The job was worth $320.11 of my time. Instead, I spent 2.5 hours at an impound lot and paid $280 to retrieve my truck. He set the wrench down. So, when you walk into my workshop and ask me for something worth considerably more than that, I want you to understand something. I'm not going to set aside what happened because you're asking politely. I'm not asking you to, she said. Then what are you asking? I'm asking you to look at the contract. Once. For whatever reason you choose. Not for my company and not for me. He was quiet for a moment. The refrigerator-sized calibration unit sat half-assembled on the bench to his right. He looked at it. Then he looked at the binder. I'll read it, he said at last. Once. Not for your company and not for your deal. Because whoever wrote page 117 is the same kind of person who wrote the Charlotte document. And those people function in the dark. I don't like what they do in the dark. Diana nodded. She opened the binder to page 117 and turned it toward him. Nathan pulled a stool over from under the bench and sat down and began to read. He read the way experienced people read things that matter. Slowly, then again, then back to page 74, forward to 91, then once more to 117. He did not ask for a pen. He did not take notes. He read with the particular stillness of a man who had done this specific kind of work before and knew that the answers were in the language and that the language only gave up its answers to patience. Diana stood at the edge of the bench and did not speak. 15 minutes passed, then 20. She found herself noticing details that had nothing to do with the contract. The way he turned a page by the corner, the alignment of the tools on the back bench, the small scar across the knuckle of his right index finger, the fact that when he breathed, the sound was completely even. There was a quality in the air of the workshop that she had not felt in a long time, possibly years, and she sat with it for a few minutes before she realized what it was. It was the quality of a space where no one was performing, where nothing was being managed, where the work was simply the work. At 38 minutes, Nathan's jaw shifted. He went back to page 117, then to a footnote on page 162. Neither Margaret Holt nor any of her team had flagged. He read it twice. He ran a finger from the footnote across to the capital ratio clause, then up to the governance schedule on page 91, and something in his expression settled. Not satisfaction. The opposite of satisfaction. The specific expression of a person who has confirmed the thing they hoped they would not find. Ms. Mercer, he said. She moved closer. This wasn't an accident. He turned the binder so she could see. Page 117 is the trigger. Page 74 is the ratio test. Page 91 is the governance handoff. On their own, any of these clauses could appear in a completely standard joint venture agreement. He put his finger on the footnote on page 162. But this is the mechanism. Read the definition of ratio breach in this footnote. Not financial distress, not insolvency, not any standard threshold you would associate with genuine risk. A very narrow technical event tied to a specific subcategory of your capital contribution schedule. One that, given the contribution timeline you've agreed to, will almost certainly be triggered within the first 20 months of the venture. Diana looked at the footnote. She read it twice. The language was clean. That was the point. And when it triggers, Nathan said, governance rights transfer. Not directly to Vantage Ridge. To a subsidiary entity named in a separate appendix. I would need another hour to trace the full ownership chain. But based on the structure, that entity will be a Vantage Ridge affiliate placed far enough downstream to avoid immediate regulatory attention. She did not look away from the page. So the moment we sign, she said. The moment you sign, Nathan said, you have roughly 20 months to trip a wire that your own contribution schedule makes nearly unavoidable. And when you trip it, the controlling interest in this joint venture, including a meaningful percentage of your own firm's operational platform, transfers to an entity whose ownership you have never seen. He closed the binder. The sound of it was very clean in the air of the workshop. $1.8 billion of exposure. You would be handing them your own keys. Diana stood at the edge of the workbench and looked at the closed binder. She did not look at Nathan. She looked at the binder for a long time. Then she said, how did you see it in Charlotte when no one else did? He picked up the rag from the bench. Because I helped write a structure like this once, early in my career. For a client I didn't ask enough questions about. I've spent 4 years being able to recognize it in other people's work. She absorbed that without comment. Then she said, about this morning. Nathan shook his head, one brief motion. Don't. She waited. Ms. Mercer, the apology cost you nothing. If you want to do something about this morning, do it differently tomorrow. That's the only version that counts. She picked up the contract and placed it back in her bag. She took a business card from her coat pocket and wrote a number on the back of it. Her direct line, the one she gave to 4 people in the world, and set it on the corner of the workbench. If you ever need anything. He looked at the card without picking it up. I probably won't, but I'll keep it. She accepted that. She walked to the door. Before she stepped out, she turned. One more thing. If I go back and cancel this signing, Vantage Ridge is going to push hard. They'll offer to revise. They'll produce a cleaner version. They'll be very persuasive about it. Nathan set a screwdriver down on the bench. Don't sign the cleaner version either. The people who built the first one will build the second one. The structure will be different. The outcome won't be. She nodded once and walked out into the November air and got into the car without looking back. On the ride back across the river, she took out the impound release form from her coat pocket and looked at Nathan Collier's name at the top of the page. She had given an order without looking at his face. She had been precise and decisive and completely wrong, and the only reason she was sitting in this car, with the company still intact, was because a man she had dismissed before he could matter had chosen, for reasons that had nothing to do with her, to tell her the truth anyway. She put the form back in her pocket. The city came back toward her through the windshield. When she reached the tower, she took the elevator directly to the 29th floor. Philip Crane was standing in the hallway. Margaret Holt was in the conference room with all 6 binders open. Scott Beale was seated in the corner, trying very hard to look as though he was part of the furniture. The Vantage Ridge delegation had been sent back to their hotel an hour earlier with a message from Margaret's office that a final compliance item had surfaced and that the firm would be in contact regarding scheduling. Diana walked into the room and set the contract on the table. We are not signing. Philip opened his mouth. Page 117 is a trigger, she said. Page 162 is the mechanism. Governance transfers to an undisclosed downstream affiliate within 20 months of execution. We sign this. We hand Vantage Ridge our operational platform from the inside. The room went completely still. Margaret Holt pulled the binder toward her and opened to page 162 without speaking. Diana slid it across. Trace the subsidiary in the appendix. Get the full ownership chain. When you have it, we'll decide how to respond. She turned to Scott Beale. He sat up in his chair as if he had been called on unexpectedly in a class he hadn't studied for. You spoke up when you didn't have to, she said. I want you leading the internal review team on this. Scott looked at her. Yes, said. Just yes, nothing else. Philip Crane lowered himself into his chair at the end of the table and put both hands on the surface in front of him and looked at nothing in particular for a moment. Then he looked at Diana. Who found it? She looked at him steadily. A man whose truck I had towed this morning. She paused. I'll explain later. Philip did not ask for more. He understood the shape of what she was telling him even without the details. Margaret Holt worked through the night. She traced the Vantage Ridge subsidiary across 5 jurisdictions and 4 shell entities, and by 3 in the morning had assembled an ownership chart that was clean, damning, and exactly what Nathan Collier had predicted. It would be in 37 words standing in a workshop on Hartwell Street. The affiliate on page 162 was owned by a holding company in the Cayman Islands. That holding company was owned by a Luxembourg-registered trust. The trust's beneficial ownership led, after 2 more layers, to a private investment vehicle with deep administrative ties to Vantage Ridge's founding partners. The governance handoff clause was not a drafting error. It was the entire architecture of the deal. The $1.8 billion was the entry price. The joint venture was the vehicle. And the clause on page 117 was the door through which Mercer Capital would have walked out of its own firm. Diana called Bradley Ashworth, Vantage Ridge's lead negotiator, at 8 in the morning. His voice on the phone was smooth and entirely unruffled. The voice of a man who had been through the early stages of a deal unwinding before and had a protocol for it. He said he was so sorry to hear there had been a complication. He said the Vantage Ridge team was more than willing to take another pass at any language that gave her legal team concern. He said they could have a revised draft prepared for end of week. He said all of this with the particular warmth of a person who already knew what the revision would contain. Diana let him finish. Then she said, "Mr. Ashworth, Mercer Capital is withdrawing from the joint venture." There was a silence. It lasted 4 full seconds. Then he said he was very sorry to hear that, and hoped they might find other ways to work together in the future. Diana said she did not. She ended the call. The withdrawal announcement went out by noon. Mercer Capital's stock dropped 6% in the first 2 hours. By the following morning, 2 financial journalists had begun asking questions about the affiliate structure. By the end of the week, an investigative piece in a trade publication had outlined the full ownership chain that Margaret had mapped. Within 3 weeks, 2 other firms that had been in late-stage discussions with Vantage Ridge pulled out without public explanation. The pattern became visible once someone drew the first line. The Securities and Exchange Commission opened a preliminary inquiry into Vantage Ridge Partners' deal structures. Bradley Ashworth retained outside counsel. The founding partners of Vantage Ridge issued a statement describing the affiliate structure as a standard industry instrument. Nobody believed them. And then the thing that Diana had not expected happened. 2 of the firms that had pulled out called Mercer Capital directly, not to discuss new business, to ask quietly who had surfaced the analysis. The name they eventually learned, through Scott Beale's internal review documentation, which Diana had allowed to circulate to the relevant party, was Nathan Collier. An analyst named Priya Weston at one of those firms tracked down the original Charlotte memo from 4 years earlier. She read all 30 pages. She sent a copy to a professor at Carnegie Mellon's Tepper School of Business, who taught a course on structured finance. He read it on a Sunday afternoon and spent the following Tuesday's class discussing it without using Nathan's name because he didn't have permission to, but describing the analysis as among the most precise structural dissections of embedded governance risk he had encountered in 20 years of teaching. Nathan Collier did not know any of this for several weeks. He was on Hartwell Street. He was fixing things. Bradley Ashworth did not accept the situation graciously. That was not in his nature and never had been. He made calls. He pushed back through intermediaries. He suggested to at least one board member at a firm that had pulled out that the Mercer analysis was motivated by competitive rather than compliance concerns. He said this in a lunch meeting in a private room at a restaurant in downtown Pittsburgh, and he said it with the confidence of a man who had spent 20 years saying things in private rooms and having them stay there. They did not stay there this time. The person across the table from him, a portfolio manager named Helen Rourke, who had known Diana Mercer since they were both junior analysts at the same firm, wrote down exactly what he said, word for word, in a small notebook she kept in her jacket pocket. She sent it to the SEC inquiry team the following morning. 3 months later, Vantage Ridge Partners was formally charged with securities fraud. The affiliate structure buried in the appendix of no fewer than 7 joint venture agreements across 4 years of deal-making was cited as a deliberate and systematic mechanism for governance capture. Bradley Ashworth was named as a primary architect. He was asked in a deposition whether he had been aware that the clause on page 117 of the Mercer Capital contract was designed to trigger governance transfer within 20 months of execution. He said he had not. He said it in a voice that had none of the warmth it had carried on the phone with Diana. He said it in the voice of a man who had spent a long time being certain that the rooms he operated in had no windows, and had discovered too late that he was wrong. Diana did not give interviews during this period. She did not issue statements. She did not appear on the financial commentary programs that called her office twice a week. She attended the leadership meetings on the 34th floor that she had not previously attended, and she sat in the back without speaking, and she listened. Scott Beale noticed. Margaret Holt noticed. Eventually the analysts on the floor noticed, and the culture of the room shifted by a few degrees in a direction that nobody announced and nobody needed to. The executive parking signage in the building came down on a Friday. Diana had asked facilities to handle it the previous Wednesday. When people noticed the following Monday, nobody asked her about it. She attended a compliance reform panel at the University of Pittsburgh 3 weeks after the SEC charges were filed. She did not speak about the Vantage Ridge matter. She spoke about the structural conditions that allow fraudulent deal architecture to survive internal review. She spoke for 22 minutes. Scott Beale had helped her prepare the remarks. She acknowledged him afterward in the hallway outside the lecture room by saying, plainly, "You did the hard thing. That counts." He had no idea what to do with the sentence, so he simply said, "Thank you," and they walked to the elevator separately. On a Saturday morning in December, Diana drove herself to Hartwell Street. She parked around the corner and walked the rest of the way. She was wearing a plain wool coat and jeans and had left the car that her company leased for her in the garage. The roll-up door on the workshop was half raised, the same as before. The pickup truck was inside. Nathan Collier was at the workbench with a small motor disassembled in front of him. He looked up when her shadow came across the floor, and his expression did not change. "Ms. Mercer," he said. "Mr. Collier." She stepped inside. "I came to tell you in person. Vantage Ridge has been formally charged. 3 firms pulled out after us. The affiliate structure you traced in 40 minutes is now part of a federal fraud inquiry." Nathan picked up a small wrench from the bench and turned it in his hands. "I saw the filing," he said. "The memo I wrote 4 years ago apparently made it into a federal deposition." She had not known that. She absorbed it. "You were right about the cleaner version," she said. "They offered one. We declined." He nodded. He set the wrench down. "Other firms were protected because you spent 1 hour reading a contract for nothing," she said. "I didn't do it for other firms," Nathan said. "I know," she said. "I did it because I don't like watching the same thing happen twice." She looked around the workshop. The ordered shelves, the labeled drawers, the motor in pieces on the bench. He had built this carefully, every part of it. "I'm not here to offer you a position," she said. The corner of his mouth moved in a way that was not quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. "That's the first useful thing anyone from your side of the river has said to me in 4 years." She allowed herself something close to a smile back. Then she said, "I gave an order that cost you $280 and 2.5 hours of your day. And everything that came out right afterward happened only because of who you are. I've been thinking about that for weeks." She held the thought, then let it settle. "I don't think I can undo that morning. I can only do differently next time." Nathan looked at the motor on the bench, then at her. "That's the part that counts," he said. It was not forgiveness. He was not offering forgiveness. He was offering something more precise and more honest than forgiveness. He was acknowledging the truth of the thing she had said. She accepted it in the same spirit. She looked at the pickup truck. The bumper still had a small crease from the tow hook, just visible in the workshop light. "Did it damage anything?" He followed her gaze. "The bumper's cosmetic," he said. "Truck still runs." She nodded. She did not offer to pay for the repair. She understood by now that the offer would have been the wrong gesture. She stepped back toward the door. Before she left, she turned once more. "Can I ask you something?" He waited. "You left an industry because you were tired of explaining to people why a trap was a trap and having them choose the trap anyway. What made you explain it one more time?" He considered the question without hurrying. "Because you came and asked yourself," he said. Most people don't. Most people, when something goes wrong, they send an intermediary. You showed up. She held that. Then she walked out of the workshop into the gray December air and down the block to her car. She drove back across the bridge without turning on the radio. The river was dark below the girders, and the city was getting larger through the windshield. And she thought about a morning 6 weeks earlier, when she had given an order before she had thought to look at a face, and about the precise distance between the company she still had and the one she had nearly given away for nothing. Speed without attention was just the fastest route up to a mistake. She had been celebrated for her speed for 16 years. It had served her in 1,000 rooms and failed her in one. The difference had been a man she had not looked at. She did not intend to forget that, not as a punishment, not as a wound, as the only kind of lesson that lasts, the kind you carry because you chose to pick it up. Sometimes the people we pass without looking are the ones who see the clearest. Sometimes the order we give in a moment of certainty is the one that costs us everything we spent a decade building. Sometimes the most important thing that happens in a day is not the contract and not the signing and not the delegation waiting at the hotel. It is the man beside the truck who says nothing when he has every right to say something. Because dignity does not announce itself. It simply stands there, holding its equipment case, waiting to be seen. And the people who never take the time to look are the ones who in the end lose the most. Nathan Collier went back to the motor on the bench. He fitted a small coupling into place and tightened it to the right torque and checked the alignment and found it clean. He wiped his hands on the rag, left it folded on the bench and turned off the workshop light. The business card from Diana Mercer was on the corner of the bench. He looked at it for a moment. Then he put it in the front pocket of his work jacket, where he kept things he might need later, and pulled the roll-up door down to the latch, and walked out to the truck and drove home across the bridge. If this story stayed with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever witnessed someone being underestimated, only to discover who they really were? Share your story below. And if you want more stories like this, stories about ordinary people with extraordinary hidden depths, hit that subscribe button. I'll see you in the next one.